Imagine for a moment that you're walking the streets of Florence in the year 1513. The smell of horse manure mixed with spices from the east fills your nostrils. You hear the sound of hammers striking metal in workshops, the shouts of merchants selling their wares, and in the distance, the cathedral bell tolling the hour. But there's something else in the air, something you can't immediately identify. It's the smell of fear, of political uncertainty, of conspiracies brewing in palaces. At this very moment, in a small house on the outskirts of the city, a middle-aged man, banished from the political life he so loved, is writing by candlelight a work that would forever change our understanding of power and leadership. His name is Niccolò Machiavelli, and he is about to reveal the darkest secrets of human nature and the art of statecraft. If you're watching this video right now, leave a comment to let us know what time it is in your city, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any history and strategy content. Join us on this journey through time to understand how life worked 500 years ago and what lessons we can learn for the modern world. 16th century Europe was a continent in turmoil. The trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the east were being redrawn after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The Ottomans now controlled traditional access to the spices and silks that powered the European economy. This forced navigators like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus to seek new routes, discovering entire continents in the process. From a scientific perspective, this was a fascinating time of transition. Ptolemy's geocentric theory still dominated official thought, but Copernicus was already developing his heliocentric theories in secret. Fearing the backlash of the Catholic Church. In this context of profound change, Machiavelli observed with keen eyes how royal power operated. He had served as a diplomat and secretary to the Republic of Florence for 14 years, traveling throughout Europe and closely observing how different leaders exercised their authority. When the Medici returned to power in 1512, Machiavelli was not only dismissed but also tortured on suspicion of conspiracy. It was during this period of forced exile that he wrote The Prince, a work that to this day generates heated debates about ethics and leadership. To understand Machiavelli's genius, we must first understand what daily life was like in his time. The average life expectancy was only 35 years. Medicine was based on the theory of the four bodily humors, inherited from the ancient Greeks. Diseases were believed to be caused by imbalances between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors prescribed bloodletting for virtually every ailment, a practice we now know to be harmful in most cases. Infant mortality was extremely high, with approximately 30% of children dying before the age of 5. The cities were small and dirty by modern standards. Florence, one of the largest cities at the time, had only about 100,000 inhabitants. The streets were narrow and rarely paved. Garbage was simply thrown out of windows, and the sewage system was primitive or non-existent. The bubonic plague still periodically ravaged Europe, killing millions. It was in this hostile environment that Machiavelli developed his pragmatic view of leadership. Based on observing how successful leaders navigated these adversities, the social structure was rigidly hierarchical. At the top were the nobles, who owned land and hereditary titles. Below them, a small class of merchants and skilled artisans began to emerge in the cities. The vast majority of the population, about 90%, lived in the countryside as peasants. Many still trapped in the feudal system. Social mobility was practically non-existent. If you were born the son of a blacksmith, you would likely die a blacksmith. Machiavelli, the son of a middle-class lawyer, was fortunate enough to receive a formal education, something restricted to a tiny elite. Education was controlled almost exclusively by the Catholic Church. Most people were illiterate. Books were rare and expensive, copied by hand by monks in monasteries. Gutenberg's invention of the printing press in 1440 was just beginning to revolutionize the dissemination of knowledge. Machiavelli lived through this transition and was one of the first to understand the power of the written word to influence the masses. He wrote The Prince in vulgar Italian, not in Latin as was customary among scholars, making his ideas accessible to a wider audience. Communication was slow and precarious. A letter from Florence to Paris took weeks to arrive. News traveled at the speed of the fastest horses. This meant leaders had to make important decisions with limited and outdated information. Machiavelli observed that the most successful princes were those who could adapt quickly to changing circumstances, even without having all the information available. He called this quality virtue, a concept that goes beyond traditional moral virtue and refers to the ability to act effectively in the face of uncertainty. War was a constant in 16th century Europe. The Italian city-states were in perpetual conflict with each other and with foreign powers like France and Spain. Military technology was undergoing a revolution. Firearms were beginning to replace medieval swords and spears. Cannons were making castle walls obsolete. Machiavelli witnessed these changes and understood that leaders who adapted most quickly to new technologies would have a decisive advantage over their adversaries. A fascinating aspect of the era was the relationship between science and superstition. While a few scholars began to question ancient dogmas, most people still believed in witchcraft, astrology, and miracles. Political decisions were often based on consultations with astrologers or interpretations of omens. Machiavelli was revolutionary in proposing that politics should be based on empirical observation of human nature, not superstition or moral idealizations. He applied a quasi-scientific method to the study of power, observing patterns of behavior and drawing practical conclusions. The economy of the time was based primarily on agriculture and trade. The banking system was developing, with families like the Medici of Florence creating the first international banking networks. The concept of a corporation as we know it today did not exist. Most businesses were family-owned or based on artisan guilds. Machiavelli understood that economic power was fundamental to political power. He observed that leaders who could control financial resources were much more likely to maintain their position than those who relied solely on traditional legitimacy or personal charisma. Religion permeated every aspect of life. The Catholic Church was not only a spiritual institution, but also one of the greatest political and economic forces in Europe. The Pope controlled vast territories in central Italy and maintained his own armies. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther in 1517, was still in its infancy, but it was already beginning to fragment European Christian unity. Machiavelli observed how skillful leaders used religion as a tool of social control, regardless of their personal beliefs. He noted that the appearance of piety was more important politically than genuine piety. Art and culture flourished during the Renaissance, but they were the privilege of a very small elite. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael produced their masterpieces while the majority of the population lived in conditions we would consider primitive. Machiavelli frequented Florence's intellectual circles and understood the power of art and culture as instruments of political legitimacy. He observed how the Medici used artistic patronage to build their reputation and influence. The healthcare system was rudimentary and based on misconceptions about how the human body worked. The theory of miasmas, which attributed diseases to bad air, dominated medical thought. Human anatomy was beginning to be studied systematically, but dissecting corpses was still taboo. Andreas Vesalius would only publish his revolutionary treatise on anatomy in 1543, correcting many errors perpetuated since antiquity. Machiavelli lived in a time when death was omnipresent and unpredictable, which certainly influenced his pragmatic view of the need to act quickly and effectively. Diets were monotonous and seasonal. Food preservation was a constant challenge. Salt was one of the most valuable commodities of the time, essential for preserving meat and fish. Spices were not only seasonings, but also natural preservatives. Potatoes, tomatoes, and corn had not yet arrived from the Americas, severely limiting nutritional variety. Famine was a constant threat, especially during harsh winters or after poor harvests. Machiavelli observed how intelligent leaders maintained strategic food stocks to ensure the population's loyalty during crises. The judicial system was brutal and arbitrary. Torture was accepted as a legitimate method of extracting confessions. Punishments were public and spectacular, serving as entertainment and intimidation. The death penalty was applied for crimes we would consider minor today, The modern concept of human rights or due process did not exist. Machiavelli witnessed this brutality firsthand when he was tortured by the Medici. This experience certainly influenced his understanding of the importance of force in maintaining power. Navigation was revolutionizing the geographical understanding of the world. Medieval nautical charts, based on travelers' accounts and speculation, were being replaced by more accurate maps based on direct observations. The development of the astrolabe and the compass allowed for longer and safer voyages. Machiavelli understood that control of maritime trade routes would be fundamental to future power. Anticipating the age of colonial empires, music and literature were undergoing profound transformations. Polyphony was gradually replacing Gregorian plainchant. The printing press allowed the dissemination of literary works in vernacular languages, not just Latin. Machiavelli himself was a gifted writer, author of plays and poems. He understood the power of narrative to influence hearts and minds, using metaphors and historical examples to make his political ideas more persuasive. International trade was creating the first global exchange networks. Asian goods reached European markets through overland routes controlled by Arab and Ottoman intermediaries. African gold financed Portuguese expeditions. Spices from the East Indies were literally weighed in gold. Machiavelli observed how control of these trade flows conferred disproportionate political power on cities like Venice and Genoa. Military technology was evolving rapidly. The first muskets were heavy and inaccurate, but they were already beginning to change battle tactics. Artillery rendered medieval fortifications obsolete, forcing the development of new defensive systems. Machiavelli was one of the first theorists to understand that military superiority depended not solely on courage or numbers, but also on organization, discipline, and technology. He advocated the creation of professional armies rather than relying on mercenaries, anticipating military developments that would only become consolidated centuries later. Modern diplomacy was emerging. The first permanent embassies were being established between European courts. Codes of diplomatic conduct were being developed. Machiavelli, as a seasoned diplomat, understood that war and peace were merely different instruments for achieving political goals. He observed that the most effective leaders were those who could alternate between diplomatic charm and military threat as circumstances required. The concept of the nation-state was still in its infancy. Europe was a mosaic of principalities, city-states, kingdoms, and empires with fluid borders. Loyalty was personal, directed to a lord or ruling family, not to an abstract entity like a country. Machiavelli pioneered the idea of the state as an institution that transcends specific individuals, something that must be preserved and strengthened regardless of who is in power. The scientific revolution was in its infancy. Copernicus was formulating his heliocentric theory in secret. Galileo was not yet born. Alchemy had not yet evolved into chemistry. Aristotelian physics dominated academic thought. Machiavelli applied a proto-scientific method to the study of politics, basing his conclusions on empirical observations rather than philosophical speculation. He was one of the first to treat politics as an empirical science, not as a branch of theology or moral philosophy. The press was slowly but surely democratizing knowledge. The first newspapers began to circulate. Political pamphlets allowed the rapid dissemination of ideas. Machiavelli understood that control of information would be crucial to future political power. He anticipated the era of modern propaganda, observing how skillful leaders shaped public opinion through narrative. Geographical exploration was expanding the mental horizons of the time. Columbus's discoveries had revealed entire continents. Vasco da Gama had established sea routes to Asia. Magellan would prove the Earth was round by circumnavigating the globe. Machiavelli lived in a time when maps were constantly being redrawn, and he understood that adaptability would be essential for leaders who wanted to thrive in a rapidly changing world. The financial system was becoming more sophisticated. The first marine insurance companies protected merchants against shipwreck. Banks developed complex credit instruments. Double-entry accounting, invented by the Italians, revolutionized business management. Machiavelli observed that military and political power increasingly depended on financial resources. Not just feudal traditions or personal charisma, medicine was beginning to question ancient dogmas. Human anatomy was being studied systematically for the first time since antiquity. New medicines were arriving from the Americas. The theory of humors still held sway, but it was beginning to be challenged by empirical observations. Machiavelli lived in a time when death was omnipresent, and this certainly influenced his pragmatic view of the need to act effectively before opportunities are lost. The lessons Machiavelli drew from this turbulent era remain relevant today. He understood that effective leaders must be able to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. They must understand that perception often trumps reality. They must build networks of loyalty based on mutual interests, not just idealism. They must be prepared to make difficult decisions with limited information. And above all, they must understand that power is a means to greater ends, not an end in itself. Machiavelli's world was brutal, uncertain, and full of opportunities for those brave enough to seize them. His lessons on strategic leadership, drawn from careful observation of how power actually works, continue to offer valuable insights for anyone seeking to understand the deep workings of human influence. The human psychology Machiavelli observed remains remarkably consistent across the centuries. He noted that people respond more to fear than to love, not out of cruelty, but because fear is a more reliable and enduring emotion. Love may evaporate with changing circumstances, but fear based on respect for competence and determination creates a more solid foundation for leadership. Modern neuroscience studies confirm that the human brain processes threats more quickly and viscerally than rewards, validating Machiavelli's empirical observations. 16th century urban life was a perfect laboratory for studying human behavior. Under pressure, cities were densely populated, with people from different social classes living in forced proximity. Conflicts were constant, from trade disputes to family rivalries that spanned generations. Machiavelli observed how effective leaders navigated these tensions, using strategic alliances and maintaining delicate balances of power. He realized that neutrality was rarely a viable option, forcing leaders to make difficult choices that inevitably created enemies. The architecture of the time reflected these political realities. The palaces of the powerful were simultaneously luxurious residences and defensive fortresses. The windows were small and high, making attacks difficult. The gates were massive and constantly guarded. The interior gardens offered safe spaces for confidential conversations, away from prying ears. Machiavelli frequented these spaces as a diplomat and observed how physical design influenced power dynamics. He noted that intelligent leaders carefully controlled access to the spaces where important decisions were made. Food was not only a basic necessity, but also a sophisticated political tool. Banquets were occasions to demonstrate wealth, seal alliances, and intimidate rivals. The ability to offer rare and expensive foods signaled economic power. Machiavelli observed how skillful leaders used hospitality as diplomacy, creating psychological obligations in their guests. He also noted that controlling the food supply was one of the most effective ways to maintain popular loyalty, especially during crises. The apprenticeship system was based on guilds that tightly controlled access to different crafts. A young man spent years as an apprentice, then as a journeyman, before perhaps becoming a master. This system created professional loyalties that transcended traditional political loyalties. Machiavelli observed how shrewd leaders cultivated the support of guilds, recognizing that skilled craftsmen were essential to urban prosperity. He realized that technical knowledge was becoming a form of power independent of aristocratic lineage. Language was undergoing profound transformations. Latin remained the language of scholarship and international diplomacy, but vernacular languages were gaining prestige. Machiavelli deliberately wrote in vulgar Italian, recognizing that effective communication required speaking the language of the target audience. He observed that successful leaders were often polyglots, able to communicate directly with different groups without relying on interpreters who could distort their messages. Music played an important role in social and political life. Courts maintained professional musicians who not only entertained, but also served as cultural diplomats, songs could spread news, influence opinion, and even incite revolts. Machiavelli understood that controlling cultural narratives was as important as controlling armies or treasures. He observed how intelligent leaders patronized artists, who created works that glorified their achievements and legitimized their power. Time was conceptualized very differently than it is today. Precise clocks didn't exist. Life was governed by sunrises and sunsets, church bells, and the seasons. This more fluid perception of time influenced political strategies. Machiavelli noted that effective leaders needed strategic patience, knowing when to act quickly and when to bide their time. He observed that excessive haste was as dangerous as prolonged hesitation. Death was omnipresent and unpredictable. Epidemics could decimate entire populations in a matter of months. Simple accidents often turned fatal due to rudimentary medicine. This constant proximity to mortality profoundly influenced political decisions. Machiavelli observed that effective leaders maintained clear succession plans and built institutions that could survive the death of specific individuals. He understood that political immortality was only possible through well-structured systems. Information was power in a much more literal sense than it is today. News arrived via horse messengers, letters were regularly intercepted, and rumors spread quickly through informal networks. Machiavelli developed sophisticated networks of informants during his diplomatic career. He observed that successful leaders invested heavily in intelligence, recognizing that accurate and timely information was often more valuable than gold or soldiers. Justice was administered very differently than in our time. Trials were public and often turned into spectacles. Torture was accepted as a legitimate method of interrogation. Punishments were severe and administered publicly to serve as a deterrent. Machiavelli observed that effective leaders used the judicial system both to maintain order and to eliminate political opponents. He noted that the appearance of justice was often more important than substantial justice. International trade was creating the first global networks of economic dependence. Asian goods reached European markets through routes controlled by different powers. A disruption at any point on these routes could cause shortages and inflation. Machiavelli understood that control of strategic points on trade routes conferred disproportionate power. He observed that visionary leaders were beginning to think in terms of global economic dominance, not just local territorial control. Communication technology was evolving slowly. Gutenberg's printing press was spreading across Europe, but it was still expensive and controlled by a few. Most people relied on oral communication for information. Machiavelli recognized that this technological transition was creating new opportunities to influence public opinion. He observed that progressive leaders were beginning to use the press as a propaganda tool, anticipating developments that would only become concrete centuries later. Medicine was beginning to question ancient dogmas. Cadaver dissection, banned for centuries, was being practiced secretly in some universities. New medicines were arriving from the newly discovered Americas. The theory of humors still held sway, but empirical observations were beginning to contradict traditional explanations. Machiavelli lived in this time of transition between superstition and science, and this influenced his pragmatic approach to politics, based on observation rather than dogma. Navigation was revolutionizing not only trade, but the entire European understanding of the world. Medieval maps based on speculation were being replaced by accurate nautical charts. Instruments like astrolabes and compasses allowed for longer and safer voyages. Machiavelli understood that this geographic expansion was creating unprecedented political opportunities. He foresaw that control of the seas would be crucial to future power. Education was undergoing gradual transformations. Universities, controlled by the church, began to incorporate rediscovered classical texts. Renaissance humanism emphasized the study of rhetoric, history, and moral philosophy. Machiavelli was a product of this humanistic education, but he applied his classical knowledge to the analysis of contemporary political situations. He observed that educated leaders had significant advantages over those who relied solely on intuition or tradition. Art was becoming a sophisticated political tool. Paintings and sculptures were not only decorative, but also vehicles of propaganda. Official portraits projected power and authority. Frescoes in public buildings told stories that legitimized political regimes. Machiavelli frequented artistic circles and observed how intelligent leaders used art to shape public perceptions. He understood that investing in art was an investment in long-term political power. Religion remained a dominant political force, but its influence was being challenged. In subtle ways, clerical corruption was widely known and criticized. Reform movements were beginning to emerge within the church itself. Machiavelli observed that effective leaders maintained careful relationships with religious authorities, respecting their social influence while resisting excessive political interference. He noted that apparent piety was politically useful, regardless of personal beliefs. The military system was evolving rapidly. Feudal armies based on aristocratic knights were being replaced by professional forces that included infantry and artillery. New tactics were being developed to incorporate firearms. Fortifications were being redesigned to withstand cannon attacks. Machiavelli pioneered the idea that states should maintain standing armies, rather than relying on mercenaries. He understood that a monopoly on legitimate violence was essential to political stability. Modern diplomacy was emerging from the ashes of the feudal system. Permanent embassies replaced temporary diplomatic missions. International codes of conduct were being developed. Treaties became more sophisticated and specific. Machiavelli, as a seasoned diplomat, observed that successful negotiations depended on careful preparation, accurate information, and perfect timing. He noted that effective diplomats were often more valuable than generals. The economy was becoming more complex and interconnected. Banks developed sophisticated financial instruments. Insurance protected commercial investments. Credit systems allowed the financing of risky ventures. Machiavelli observed that leaders who understood finance had decisive advantages over those who thought only in terms of military strength. He anticipated that future wars would be decided as much by financial resources as by courage in battle. Family life was structured very differently than it is today. Marriages were often political or economic arrangements. Children were seen as investments in the future. High infant mortality meant families needed to have many children to ensure offspring. Machiavelli observed that intelligent leaders used strategic marriages to build lasting political alliances. He understood that family networks were crucial to maintaining power across generations. The concept of privacy was very different from today. People lived in constant proximity, with multiple generations sharing small spaces. Secrets were difficult to keep. Reputations could be quickly built or destroyed through gossip. Machiavelli observed that effective leaders carefully managed their public image, recognizing that perceptions were often more important than realities. He noted that appearances had real political power. Social mobility was extremely limited, but not non-existent. Successful merchants could purchase titles of nobility. Courageous soldiers could be rewarded with land. Talented artists could gain aristocratic patronage. Machiavelli observed that intelligent leaders created limited channels of social mobility to encourage loyalty and competence. He understood that completely rigid systems were vulnerable to revolt, while highly fluid systems threatened traditional hierarchies. Technology was advancing rapidly in certain areas. Printing allowed for rapid reproduction of texts. Improvements in metallurgy created more effective weapons. Advances in navigation expanded geographic horizons. Machiavelli observed that leaders who quickly adopted new technologies gained temporary but significant advantages over conservative rivals. He understood that technological innovation was becoming an independent political factor. Public entertainment served important political functions. Religious festivals kept populations occupied and satisfied. Tournaments demonstrated military power. Public executions intimidated potential dissidents. Machiavelli observed that effective leaders used entertainment to manipulate popular moods. He noted that bread and circuses were necessary to maintain social stability, especially in times of economic crisis. Intellectual life was flourishing in limited circles. Informal academies brought together scholars to discuss classical texts. Correspondence between intellectuals created networks for the exchange of ideas. Debates on philosophical and political issues intensified. Machiavelli actively participated in these circles and observed how ideas influenced political action. He understood that leaders who ignored intellectual developments risked becoming obsolete. Public health was a virtually non-existent concept. Cities were hotbeds of disease due to poor sanitation. Epidemics spread rapidly through dense populations. Medical knowledge was limited and often counterproductive. Machiavelli observed that leaders who managed to keep their populations relatively healthy had economic and military advantages over those who neglected public health. He anticipated that preventive medicine would become more important than curative. Medicine, human and animal energy were virtually the only available power sources. Water and windmills harnessed limited natural forces. Most work was done manually. This meant that controlling labor was crucial to any enterprise. Machiavelli observed that effective leaders treated workers as strategic resources, not just expenses. He understood that motivation and organization could multiply the effectiveness of any workforce. In a world that is changing ever more rapidly, Machiavelli's lessons from a time of profound transformation remain surprisingly relevant. He taught us that effective leadership requires adaptability, pragmatism, and a deep understanding of human nature. His observations on power, influence, and decision-making under uncertainty continue to offer valuable insights for anyone seeking to understand how to navigate complex and competitive environments. Machiavelli's world may have been brutal and uncertain, but it was also an extraordinary laboratory for understanding the eternal mechanisms of human power and influence.